Okay, thank you. So yesterday I explained to you a strategy to prove the local limit theorem in hyperbolic groups, and in this strategy we needed to justify the fact that when you look at the Green function along the geodesic, it's essentially multiplicative, and it's a theorem that Peter proved last week, but that I will write again due to Ancona. In 86, says like that, something like that. So all the time you have gamma hyperbolic and mu a good probability measure on gamma. So I will not write it again in all the statements. And GR of xy is a Green function from x to y with parameter r. And Ancona tells you the following for all r between, say, 1 and the spectral radius, open here, there exists some constants, C, such that whenever you take 3 points x, y, and z on a geodesic, like that, well, x and then y and then z, and then you can look at the Green function from x to z, and you can ask how it relates to the product of the Green function from x to y and from y to z, and there is an inequality which is always true, that you have a lower bound like that. Because if you have a path from x to y and a path from y to z, you can concatenate them, and this gives you a way to go from x to z. So this is a lower bound, but a priori it's not an upper bound because there may be many paths that go from x to z and that do not go through y. But in hyperbolic groups, several paths, enough paths will have to go through y, and so you also get an upper bound like that. And hopefully Peter gave a proof last week, and I will not give the proof again, but only sketch what was going on. The idea is that, okay, you want to go from x to z, or you want to go from x to z, you want to show that with high probability you will go through a small ball around y. And then you can do some kind of inductive argument and say, okay, first I will show that I go through a big ball, and then if you know that you go through a big ball, you can do some inductive argument and then show you can go through a smaller ball and slightly smaller and so on, until the size of the ball can get to a constant. And if each time you do something that you control, in the end you will still have something, and that will be enough. So the main point of the argument that Peter gave you is something like that. What you need to do is you fix x, y, and z like that, and you put a big ball of radius n around the point y. And you assume that x and z are not too far apart. Say that this is bounded by some multiple of n, set at 10 times n. And then you want to show that most trajectory from x to z will get inside this ball B. Or if you prefer, the trajectories that avoid the ball, they already have a very small weight. Let me just introduce some notation. The relative Green function, GR from x to y through a set S, it will be the sum over all paths from x to y of the probability of the path, just as usual, but I restrict my set of paths. That's something I've already done several times. And the condition will be that the intermediate points on the path gamma are in S for all I, maybe not the starting point, maybe not the end point, but the intermediate points are all in the set S. For all I, strictly between 0 and the length of gamma. So that's the definition of the relative where you just walk inside S. So what you need to do in this kind of situation is show that the Green function from x to z outside of the ball B, so in element of the ball B, you want this to be super small. And by super small, I mean super small. I will need something like, the form is not really important. say, a tower of exponential like that, exponential minus exponential of epsilon n. That's super small. Why is that super small? Because you have trajectory that goes from x to z, and since they're roughly at distance 20 times n, and your random walk is admissible, it can go from anywhere to anywhere, it will go from x to z with a probability which is at least exponentially small. So, sorry? Epsilon does not depend on n.
No, 10.
No, 10 is fixed. Yes, 10 is fixed. 10 is 10. Well, maybe 10 depends on the hyperbolicity constant of the space. Okay, 10 is 10 of delta r, it's fixed, and then epsilon depends on 10 of delta. You want something like that. If you get something like that, it tells you that most trajectory will go inside the ball, and then inside a smaller ball, you can do some iterative argument, and you're done. So this, Peter gave you the proof. I will not do it again, and I will concentrate on these kind of questions. And to prove Ancona inequality, you need to show this, and this is very easy, because what can you do? You compute, it's a sum over all paths like that, from x to z outside of b of r to the power of the length of your path times probability to follow the path. And then here r is strictly below the spectral radius, which means that you can take an r0, or take r0, which is strictly bigger than small r and strictly smaller than the spectral radius. And then here, you're in hyperbolic space. In a hyperbolic space, if you want to go from here to here by avoiding a ball like that, you can sometimes do it like that. But hyperbolic geometry tells you that such a path has to be extremely long. The length of a path like that has to be at least exponential. And maybe the one here is not a one, but something that depends on delta. But say the length has to be exponential. And it means that in the sum here, since my random walk has finite range, all the paths I'm summing over here, they have to be super long. So I can bound this from above by all gamma from x to z, for which the length is at least this exponential n times r to the power of the length and the probability to follow this. And then I will introduce by force my r0. I will say that this is r over r0 times r0 to the power and the length of gamma times the probability to follow. Okay, I can do this. And now r divided by r, it's something strictly smaller than 1. So you can write as r0, you can write it as something smaller than 1, so some exponential of minus epsilon. And then this is bounded. Okay, the epsilon is not at the right place. I don't care. It's bounded by this is exponential minus epsilon times the length of the path. But since I'm summing over a super long path, this is exponentials. Not exactly the same form as here, but well, you can bound one by the other. So it means that in the end, this I get a bound that does not depend on the path. I can take the bound out. And then I get a sum over some passes of this. It's some part of the green function at index r0. And then I bound this from above by the sum over all passes, which is exactly the green function from x to z, because I know that this green function is converging. And then I'm almost done, except that I need some upper bound on this. But you have something called Harnack inequality that tell you that green function can vary at most exponentially with the distance between the points. Precisely because, well, you can construct explicit passes from x to z for which you know the probability that it's followed by the random walk. So this is at most a constant times the distance between your points. And the distance between your points, here I was careful enough to make sure that it's bounded by 20 times n. So it's something exponential. And something exponential like that is completely killed by this one. So you get your super exponential bound and you're really happy. This completes the proof of the theorem of Onkonen. And that's well and good, except that it's not enough for what we want to do. Because what we want to do is to obtain some differential equation when some parameter small r tends to the spectral radius. And in particular, just to remind you, we wanted to have something like that. The second derivative was something like the cube of the first derivative. And here you have some implicit constant. And you want this to really be a constant. You want to this when r tends to r. So it means the constant should not blow up. If the constant blows up, it does not tell you anything. So if you want to play this game, you will apply Onkonen inequalities again and again. So you need to know to have Onkonen inequalities with a constant that does not blow up when you go to the spectral radius. And if you look at this proof, you see I said, okay, strictly below the spectral radius, so I have some margin, and I use this margin to get my estimate. This epsilon, it will depend on r. So you can follow the computation, and here, this constant, C, it's C of r, and it blows up to infinity when small r tends to big R. And it blows up to infinity in a bad way. But just the fact that it blows up to infinity and show that this will not be enough for what we want to do. So what we really need is a theorem like that, except that here I don't want to have an open interval, I want to have a closed interval. And even better, I would like my independent of R in the whole interval. In fact, since this interval will be compact, if you can do it for an individual R, then the proof will give you a uniform constant. So let's forget about it. But what you really need is to be able to do it exactly at the spectral radius. In fact, that's what you need to do. Well, first, it's not a bit that the question even makes sense at the spectral radius, because this is this green function. It's a power series. You know that it converges it's an analytic function. It's defined on the open disk of radius big R. So here it converges, but at big R, you don't know, it depends on the analytic functions. It turns out that in this situation, the function is still well defined at big R. And so it will make sense to ask this question for the green function at big R. The green function will not be infinite. And this is not specific to hyperbolic groups. It's a general phenomenon for random walks. It's a theorem due to Guivarch. Tell you the following: you take some group, gamma, and you assume that it's not too small. I mean, you assume that the growth of gamma is at least cubic. So you exclude finite groups, you exclude Z, or groups that have a finite index subgroup which is equal to Z, and you exclude Z squared, or groups with a finite index subgroup isomorphic to Z squared. So whenever you look at the big group, it will be okay. And then you take some good probability measure. It does not even really need to be good, in fact. And you look at the green function at its spectral radius, and Guivarch tells you that this is finite. So very general theorem, and the proof goes like that. You assume that it's infinite, and if it's infinite, well, infinite green functions mean recurrent random walks, except that here it's not really a random walk because I'm twisting my probabilities with this factor R. But when the green function is infinite, there is a trick to build from this a probability measure for which the green function will also be infinite. And then it means that you have a recurrent random walk on your group. It's known by work of Varopoulos that the only groups that can carry recurrent random walks have growth at most quadratic. So if Assume the group is big enough, you're not in this situation. So that's very nice, because until now we had absolutely no information on the green function at the spectral radius, and that's a first a priori assumption, given to you by God or by Guy Barche, as you like. So first thing you can work with, and this fact we will use it a lot in our estimates. Say we have converging series, so we can start estimating stuff. So we can ask the question by Ancona at the spectral radius. Does it make sense? And what we can prove with Laley is that so gamma is hyperbolic, mu is good, and then there exists a constant C such that exactly as a spectral radius, or uniformly for R between 1 and big R, you take 3 points like that. And then the green function is bounded by this constant. Xy, yz, and the same lower bound. So we extend the theorem of Ancona up to the spectral radius. Except that we need an additional assumption that I did not write yet. We need the symmetry here. The second place is a proof where this plays a role. And it should not. I mean, I'm sure this theorem is still true if you remove the assumption of symmetry. Okay, so that's what we want to prove. And we will use the same strategy. I mean, we just need to prove this. If you can prove this just as a spectral radius, then you're done. So that's what we will try to do. Except that we cannot play this trick. We cannot increase the parameter. So, of course, we know that the trajectories from here to here are super long. But when you increase your parameter R, you are giving more and more weight, exponentially more weight to longer and longer trajectories. So it might be the case that when you arrive precisely at the spectral radius, long trajectories start to dominate your sum. Because short trajectories have a smaller weight. What you just know is that strictly after big R, the sum blows up. But you don't know if it blows up because long trajectories have already so much weight here that afterwards it blows up, or you don't know if it blows up because of short trajectories and maybe long trajectories are still negligible exactly as the spectral radius. And that's the question we need to address to prove this. And the problem is that you don't have a lot of information about the green function at the spectral radius. That is the only one we have for now is this one. It is finite, which is already good, but not enough to start computing things. So there are two steps in the proof where you start to improve step by step the knowledge, the information you have on your green function, and you start to use it in the next step. And so the first thing you need to do is get information a little bit more precise than this one. And it's something that I want to call a priori bounds. And it's a lemma that tells you the following. There exists some C such that for all integer n, you look at the sum of the values of the green function over the sphere of radius n. Except not just this sum, because it's not well behaved. You start from the identity, you go to x, and then you come back. This is something we have already seen yesterday in the expression for the derivative of the green function. The derivative of the green function is given by the sum over the whole space, and here I'm not summing over the whole space, I'm summing just over the sphere. And the statement is that this is uniformly bounded, independently of n. Okay. Then it will help you control the behavior of green function on long trajectories. Because, well, the sum is finite, and for most points, here you have exponentially many points. So if the sum is finite, it means that for most points, this will be exponentially small. And maybe you can start playing with this to get your estimates. except that you don't really know for which points this will be exponentially small. And the proof of the a priori that tell you anything about the good point, the bad point, the distribution, or whatever, it just tell you this. Now I should do two. I should prove you the a priori bounds, and then show you how they are used to prove the statement. And this is a trick. This is really a trick using submultiplicativity or supermultiplicativity. And I will rather give the second part of the proof and come back to this at the end if I have time. And I won't have time. Well, who knows? Okay. So I want to use these a priori bounds to control a green function like that outside of the ball. So just for simplicity, to be able to make pictures, I will assume that my group is a surface group. So it's embedded in the hyperbolic disk so that I can make pictures for you. It's already what I did, more or less. So assume gamma is embedded in the hyperbolic disk. So here is the picture. Your hyperbolic disk, the boundary at infinity, and up to translating everything to the left by 1 minus 1, I can also assume that my point here is 0 in the hyperbolic disk. So you have a point x here. You have a ball of radius n around around 0. You have y, z just on the other side. And you're asking, okay, I want to understand the random walk trajectories going from here to here. And I want to sum all their weights and see that I get something super small. And all I know is that for most points at distance n, things are exponentially small. What I will do is that I will put some sets that the random walk cannot avoid when going from x to z. So let me put a set here. Here, and it's symmetric. To be sure that, okay, if you start, let me call B1, B for barrier, the union of these two sets. Here. Then if you have a random walk, it starts from here. It goes to Z, and it does not enter the ball in the middle. It will have to reach the variable B1 at some point. And maybe the jump from X to B1, I will be able to control them with my a priori bounds. And then, well, just one barrier will not be enough. Let me put a second one here. Let me call this B2, the union of these two stuff here. Then your walk, it has to cross B1, and then, even if you're on B1, if you want to reach Z, you will have to reach B2 also. And it's just thick enough so that the walk with finite cannot walk, jump past the barrier. So then my work starts from X, it will have to go to the barrier B1, then to the barrier B2, and then, let me put a lot of them. And this would be the last barrier, let me call it BK. And K will have to be chosen suitably. And then, we'll say okay, the probability to go from X to Z outside of the ball, so the green function from X to Z outside, okay, I'm sorry, I have a collision of notation. This is a ball B, and this is a barrier BI. It's not the same B. To emphasize it, let me call it, okay. Outside of the ball of center O and radius N, I would like to bound this from above by the probability. It's not a probability because everything is skewed by this R parameter, but think of it as a probability. It's bounded by the probability to go from X to B1, times the probability to go from B1 to B2, times the probability to go from BK minus 1 to BK, times the probability to go from BK to Y. Okay? And I put quotation mark because what does this mean? I have several points in BI. Do I mean a supreme over the point or an average or something like that? I'll have to be more precise later, but that's your intuition. And then if you have something like that and you can use your a priori bounds to show that this is less than 1/2. If you can make sure that this is less than 1/2, this is less than 1/2, and also the number k of barriers is large enough, say exponentially large, exponential of epsilon n, then if you can do this, then the bound you get, well, that's a probability, so let's say also 1/2 here. If you can do this, what you get in the end is a bound which will be at most 1/2 to the power of the number of barriers. And that's a tower of exponentials, just as you wanted. That's what you want to do. Except that you need to be more precise about this. And first, what do I claim? It's reasonable to assume I can put exponentially many barriers here. The reason is that, okay, here, this half circle, you're in a hyperbolic space. It has length exponential n. This stuff has length exponential n. So it means that if you stay, okay, your barriers, they have to be disjoint, but if you space them by 1, put a barrier, you wait space 1, you put a barrier, you wait a space 1, and so on. In this way, you could put exponential n barriers. So don't require exponential n, I just want exponential epsilon n of them, which means I will be able to put a much larger spacing by 1 between the barriers, and that will help me. And still, I will be able to put a great number of barriers. So that's really hyperbolic geometry that helps you here. So that's not unreasonable to do this. And that's what we will do. Now I need to say what I mean by this probability to go from X to B1, B2 to B2, and so on. You can say without quotation marks that it's a sum of all trajectories from X to Z that do not enter the ball in the middle. And then such a trajectory, you can stop it at the first time it reaches B1. And then at the first time it reaches B2. And then at the first time it reaches B3. And then group together, group the trajectories according to which point they meet in B1, and then which point they meet in B2, and so on. And then what you will get will be a sum of green functions, depending on the first entry point in B1, the first entry point in B2, and so on. So just by writing a sum of the trajectories, the bound you get, the stupid bound you get is the following. You get the sum of a V1 in B1, the first entry point in B1, the V2 in B2, and Vk in Bk. And then you have the probability to go from V1 from X to V1. The probability here, it says the green function, times the green function to go from V1 to V2, times the green function to go from Vk minus 1 to Vk, times the green function to go from Vk to Z. So that's a very crude upper bound. Because for instance, now I'm forgetting the fact that my trajectory do not enter the ball. And also, maybe some trajectories, they go through V1, but then they come back to B1 at a different point, and then this trajectory will be counted several times in this sum. So it's a crude upper bound, but it will be good enough for what we want to do. And then the problem is that here it's really not like product like that. It's a sum over stuff that all depend on each other. So if you want to convert it into a product, you can either think of this as you're applying a sequence of operators with kernels and say that the norm of the product of the operators is bounded by the product of the norm and use L2 norms. And if you're familiar with this kind of argument, it's clear what this gives. But if you don't like this, you can also do it by hand, just by Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. See, when you have a sum like that, you can do a Cauchy-Schwarz inequality just on the first sum over V1. And what you will get is the sum of a v1 in v1 of the square of vx 1/2 times the sum of a v1 in v1. And then you have a sum of a v2 vk squared 1/2. Okay, it starts to look like a product because I isolated a first part which would correspond to this. Then, if you want to isolate the second part, in this sum here, you do a Cauchy again with respect to v. And then, what you will get the same first term, and then the second term you will get is sum of a v1 in v1 and v2 in v2 of gr of v1 to v2 squared 1/2. And then you get a third term, which is a sum of a v2 of something squared and so on. And then the third term, you can do a Cauchy-Schwarz again and again and again. And in the end, what you get is a product of all terms that look like this. And then you will have sum of vk minus 1 in vk minus 1 and vk in vk, same thing, gr, vk minus 1, vk squared 1/2. And then you also have a term that corresponds to going from vk to z. Really, it's just the fact that the norm operator is less than the product of the norms. And when you have a kernel operator on L2, the norm is like that. So, well, we know what we have to do. If we want to implement this strategy, we have to make sure that all these sums here, they are less than 1/2. It's not even clear that these sums are finite. But we have to make sure that they are finite and that they are bounded by 1/2. So we want bi such that yes, but here the width, it's a fixed width. It's a fixed width. So here. The size of what? The barrier, it has to go up to infinity. It starts from a point at distance n, and it goes all the way to infinity. Because maybe read from x to z that go very close to infinity, and if you want to control them with the barriers, you have to go up to infinity. So that's not obvious that the sum is finite. So you want to construct these barriers b1, bk, so that all these sums are finite, are bounded by, such that for all I, the sum for v in bi and v prime in vi plus 1 of gr of v prime squared is smaller than 1/4. If you put 1/4 here, when you take the square root, 1/2, happy. You want this. And here you see that the way to construct them is not obvious. Because if you have chosen B1, well, say B7, it interacts with B6. The barrier, because you want this sum between B6 and B7 to be controlled. And it also depends on B8. So when you want to construct them all together. And, well, you don't know a lot of things on the space. All you can use is these a priori bounds that tell you a behavior on average, but you don't know one single point how it is. So there is a very classical strategy in this kind of setting, is when you don't know how to construct something explicitly, just prove that it exists by a probabilistic argument. You will construct barriers at random, and you will show that for a typical choice, it will work. Very good tool to have in your tool bag. When nothing is explicit, use randomness, it will help you. So I can tell you what the barriers will be. I will tell you, I will prove to you that some barriers exist, and that will be enough. So how will you do that? So here, this first barrier, I don't know where it will be, but say, okay, maybe I have some interval I1, and if I take some angle theta 1 in this interval to theta 1, I can trace a line here that goes to 0, and then I thicken it up just a little bit. And this gives me a candidate barrier. And for each angle in this interval I1, I get a candidate barrier. And then let's take some second interval I2, where I will have my second candidate angle that will work, and then I3, and so on, and IK. And then you will choose theta 1, theta 2, theta k at random in these intervals and show that, in the end it works. So what does that mean? It means that you look at the space, which is this interval I1 times I2 times IK. These intervals will all have length, okay. They will have length exponential minus epsilon n. I want them to be big enough, because if they're big enough, it means you have more choices, so you're more likely to be able to do something. But I want to be able to fit at least exponential of epsilon n of them in my space of angles, so that's the biggest size I can get. And I will take them to be separated also by exponential minus epsilon n. So you have your space of angle, and then you take something of length exponential minus epsilon n, it will be your I1. Then you put a space of the same size that you will not use. Then you put an I2 of the same size, and so on. And in the end, the number of intervals you get is b exponential epsilon n divided by 2 or something like that. Or pi times exponential n. Okay, that's what you do. And then you will pick a theta bar in this stuff. And then when you have a theta bar in this stuff, you have barriers, bi of theta 1, b1, well, b of theta 1, b of theta k, and you call this b1, you call this bk, and these will be your barriers. And you will choose theta bar at random, according to some probability measure that you will put on this space. And what is the probability measure you will? Well, you will put Lebesgue measure on each interval, except that you want it to be a probability measure, so you just rescale by what you need. So the probability measure you put on this space is Lebesgue restricted to I1 divided by the length of I1. Okay. And the claim is that if you take theta bar at random for this P, it will work. I want to keep the a priori bounds. So what you need to do, you want to see that the sum is small. If the integral over your probability space is small, then you know that there is at least one point where it is. So the claim that I will have to justify is that you look at the integral for theta I in your interval I and theta I plus 1 in the interval I plus 1 of the sum for V in the barrier associated to theta I and V prime associated to the barrier for theta I plus 1. You sum VR V prime squared. And then I will integrate with respect to Lebesgue for this claim. I claim that this is super small. And by super small, I mean exponential minus alpha n, where alpha does not depend on epsilon. what is nice with this integral is that I'm not thinking about all the intervals together. I'm just looking at one part that I want to control. So here I just have two angles. If the claim is true, so if this holds, then you can, sum all this over all the intervals. Sum from I from 1 to k of these integrals. It will be smaller than how many intervals do you have? Exponential epsilon n. And maybe also I want to integrate, but not with respect to Lebesgue measure, but to measure that shows up in my space. So if you want to integrate with respect to Lebesgue measure, we normalize to be a probability measure on this interval. Then you lose again something, and the something you lose is given by the length. But I was careful enough to choose my interval rather large. Here I lose again exponential epsilon n. So you have something like that, 3 epsilon n. Yes. Yes. And once you have this integral, it's exactly what you wanted. It means if this here I'm averaging just over this angle theta I and theta I plus 1, or averaging over the whole theta bar, the same, because I have a quantity that does not depend on the other angles. And then I can put the sum inside, and you get that the integral of the sum of sometimes dp of theta bar is super small. Now you take epsilon so that 3 epsilon is much smaller than alpha. Then you get that this is exponential minus alpha over 2n. And then if n is large enough, this is at most 1/4. So you have an integral of a function of a probability space, and the integral is at most 1/4. It means that there is at least one parameter theta bar for which this is at most 1/4. And if this is at most 1/4, then each term in the sum is also at most 1/4. And each term in the sum, it's exactly what we wanted to control. Maybe I was a little bit quick, so I will write down what we get from here. This is at most 1/4 if n is large enough. So it means that there exists some theta bar, so that the sum for 1 to k, and then I should write what was between the braces. You have the sum for v in the barrier associated to theta I, and v prime associated to the barrier for theta I plus 1, of the green function from v to v prime squared. So that's the function I'm integrating in probability space. This is bounded by 1/4. And so in particular, the sum is smaller than 1/4, everything is non-negative. Each term here is bounded by 1/4, and that's exactly what we were looking for. So that's the end of the proof. Modulo the claim. Everything is inside the claim, in fact. And until now, I have not used the a priori bounds. They have to play a role. Do you have a question about what I just explained? No, it's okay. So here, my measure is symmetric. So going from V to V prime or from V prime to V is the same. So the quantity you see here, it's GR of V prime times GR of V prime V. Or if you prefer, it's GR from the identity to V minus 1 V prime, and then back. it's exactly the same, the kind of stuff we see in the a priori bounds. So I forgot to say here, I don't need mu. Mu does not need to be symmetric. The a priori bound is always true. But if you want to use it here, you want to control the square of something, and this square came out of the Cauchy-Schwarz computation. If you want to control the square of something by something like that, you will need a symmetry. And then you say, okay, I'm summing over some points, but I'm averaging over a lot of points because I'm averaging over theta. So it's not the sum over just one point. I'm averaging over everything. So essentially, I should be summing over a whole sphere or something like that. Maybe not a whole sphere, but I will be able to control this with the sum over the whole sphere. And then that's why I will be able to control this in terms of the a priori bounds. And that's why there is a hope to control something like that once you have these a priori bounds. So we want to rewrite this. So we will change sum and the integral and see what the contribution of the integral is to each pair of points or something like that. Okay? Let me call this quantity the thing I want to understand. Star. I want to understand this. So you do the Fubini. And so you get a sum for V and V prime. And then you have GR of V prime star. And then the number of times this will be counted in this integral will be given by the measure of the angles for which your point V is in the barrier of the angle. So you have times the Lebesgue measure of the theta such that V is in the theta barrier, times the Lebesgue measure of the angles theta prime, where V prime is in the barrier for theta prime. Just exchange sum and integral. What is this like? It's super classical hyperbolic geometry, and if you're played with Patterson-Sullivan measures and things like that, you know exactly what this is. You have a space, you have a point, you have the origin, you have a point V here, and you're asking if the ray from your point psi or your point theta to the origin, your barrier, you thicken it up just a little bit to make sure that the wave cannot jump past it. So it means theta will be, V will be in the barrier if the distance between V and a geodesic from O to Xi is bounded by, say, the size of the jump of your walk. And, theta. And it's the set of theta which are like that, which is called a shadow in hyperbolic geometry. I'm asking that theta is in the shadow seen from the point O of V with a radius k. What does that mean? I put a ball of radius V here. I put a ball of radius k around V. You put a light at O, and you see what is illuminated at infinity, and you have some ray that will be blocked by the ball, and that will be the shadow. And that's the theta for which V is in the barrier is exactly the shadow of V seen from O. And we know its size. The size of the shadow is exponential in the distance of V to the origin. So the Lebesgue measure of the shadow is something like exponential. So it means that here I can use this to bound here. I have the green function, which is something given by my random walk, and the rest is purely geometric. you have exponential minus the size of v, and then for the other part, it's the same, exponential minus the size of v prime. And then I have this v and v prime, and I want to get back to the identity. So maybe I can write this as e 1v prime. And then I would like to reindex this sum to, well, I'm trying to make this appear. So you want to reindex the sum and to give a new name to your point w equal to v minus 1v prime. And you want to understand a little bit how this point will be. And then you will get a sum of a w of the green function of e to w squared times something. And if the something is nice enough, you will be done. So what is the geometric situation here? And we'll exaggerate things a little bit. You have a I here, and you have I plus 1 here. And then you have v here, which is in a barrier. And you have v prime here, which is also in a barrier. And you have the origin here. What does a geodesic from v to v prime do? Okay, you say, okay, maybe I could go like that. But in hyperbolic space, it's a very bad idea to follow circles. If you want to go from v to v prime, what you will do is you will go from v to o, and you will go to o, from o to v prime, except that maybe you will have a shortcut, because maybe these geodesics, they will do something like that. So what the geodesic from v to v prime does, it's like that. And then the first time you're less than delta from the o to v prime, you go like that. And you go over to v prime. That's one of the descriptions of hyperbolicity. So if you want to understand the size of this w, which is the length of a geodesic from v to v prime, you want to understand at which moment these two geodesics from v to o and from v prime to o are close together. And it's given by the size of the gap. And the size of the gap, I was careful to put a large enough gap. The size of the gap is exponential minus epsilon n. Which means that what the geodesic will do, in fact, it will start like that. You will go, say, here around O, I put the ball of radius epsilon n. And these two geodesics, they will be close together, since the angle is like that. They will just be close together at distance epsilon n of the origin. So the geodesic from v to v prime, it will go like that, then it will jump, and then it will go like that. So the distance from v to v prime, which is the size of your new w, it's the size of v plus the size of v prime minus these two stuff here, minus 2 epsilon n, minus 2 epsilon n. But v and v prime, they were both very big because we were away from, we are outside of the ball of radius n. So this, it's at least n, it's at least n. So 2n minus 2 epsilon n, if epsilon is small enough, you know that it's at least n. Epsilon. You know it's at least n, and also since this is much smaller than this or this, you know also that, well, it's at least v plus v prime divided by 2, something like that. Okay, so now I will reindex my sum. Here I have the length of v and the length of v prime. I can relate them to the length of w, which is what I'm trying to do. So I'm happy about this. I can reindex my sum. And you get that star is bounded by the sum over, okay, the w, I said it has at least n. And then you have dr of e to w squared. Starts to look like the a priori bound, times exponential minus length of w divided by 2. I lose a factor 2. I don't really care. What matters is that there is no epsilon in here. And then, okay, if it were like that, it would be beautiful, but it's not like that. Because if you take a W, maybe there are several ways to write it as v minus 1 times v prime. So here you have a multiplicity. Multiplicity is the number of ways to decompose W as v minus 1 v prime, where v is in the first barrier and v prime is in the second one. What is this multiplicity? Take a geodesic gamma from E to W. Okay. Take gamma E to W at geodesic. Then v minus 1 gamma, no, v gamma, it's a geodesic from v to v prime. In fact, this v gamma, it's what I've drawn here on the picture. This v gamma, it's that. And I know it goes through the ball of radius epsilon n. So let me call L the length here. Then I know that V times gamma of L, it's in the ball of radius epsilon n. So V, it's written like gamma A times gamma L minus 1, where A is in the ball and radius epsilon. So if you start from W, you take a geodesic. It does not depend on the decomposition. It just depends on U. And then I've told you, okay, there are not so many V's that you can get. The V's that you can get, you have to choose an element in the ball of radius epsilon n. And you have to choose a time between 0 and the length of W. So I've just bounded the possible number of V's. And once you have fixed the V, you have fixed the V prime because W is V minus 1 V prime. So the multiplicity, it's again hyperbolic geometry that helped me a lot. It's bounded by the cardinality of the ball of radius epsilon n times the length of W plus 1. And what is the cardinality of a ball like that? It grows at most exponentially with the size. So it's exponential k times the radius, and the radius is epsilon n. And here, well, times the length of W. So the multiplicity is not too bad because you're losing something exponential. Sure, nothing you lose. You have an epsilon here because of the gap, the large enough gap you put. So star. Is bounded by the sum for the W of size at least n of Green function times what do you get? Exponential minus W over 2 times the length of W times something exponentially times exponential k epsilon n. And now you see, this only depends on the length of W. This only depends on the length of W. Here I can group together the points on a common sphere. And you get the sum over the size of the sphere, the length of W, for the sum of W in the sphere of radius k of gr of EW squared times exponential minus k over 2 k exponential k epsilon n. And now I'm where I wanted to go because this is what I control by with the a priori. This is bounded. This is bounded as my map is symmetric. And then you have tails of an exponential series. You can forget about the k, it's killed by this. And so you get exponential minus n over 3, say, times this small exponential loss And this small exponential loss you don't care about, because if epsilon is small enough, it's killed by this. This does not depend on epsilon. This only depends on the geometric characteristic of the space. So it proves the claim for alpha equal 1/4, except I cheated all the place, but okay. It's something that does not depend on epsilon, just on the geometry of the ambient space. So you're done. I think that's the end of the proof. Are you convinced? Did I lose everyone? Yes, because I want to make things independent one from the other. I think that in the non-symmetric case, the a priori bound is not really helping you because it tells you to go here and then back. You control that. But maybe to go here has a very high weight, and to go back has a very small weight that compensates the stuff. And so maybe to go here has a high weight. And in fact, in the non-symmetric case, the green function gr, it can tend to infinity at infinity along some points. So really, there is no chance that the a priori bound could be true if with gr of ex squared. It's not just wrong. So
because you're working in dimension 2.
I'm coming to this right now. So this is the end of the proof in dimension 2. Because I could draw like that. I could tell you, okay, barriers, you just take them like that. Now, what is if you're in dimension 3? Say you're in H3, you have the fundamental group of a three-dimensional compact hyperbolic manifold, and you embed that in H3, and can you play the same game? If you want to do the same stuff, you need to put a sequence of barriers between points, and these barriers, you need to parameterize them by some angle theta. And in H3, you can do it exactly in the same way. H3, that my picture will be E, because it's hard to draw, but then you have something like that. The center here, of X, which is somewhere here, Z, which is somewhere here, and you want to put a barrier here. What you can do is you put a circle at infinity here, and then you take the cone based on this one. Okay? And then if you start from X and you want to go to Z, you will have to cross the cone at some point. And that's the first barrier, and it's parameterized essentially, the angle theta is here, theta 1. And then you can take theta 2, which will be, say here, and then again, well, theta 2 here. Again, you can draw a circle like that. And you can put a cone like that. And it's again a barrier. And even if you want the boundary of the cone with angle theta 1, if you want to reach Z, you have to go to the cone of angle theta 2, and so on. So you put K-cones like that. And the cones are parameterized by some angle between 0 and pi, exactly as before. And on the 0 pi, you have a canonical Lebesgue measure, and you can talk about those. And in fact, you don't need to change one word of the proof I gave you. It's exactly the same. So in H3, it's the same. In H4, it's also the same. But if you take a general hyperbolic group, you don't have this structure for free. But you have. Any hyperbolic group can be embedded in a hyperbolic space. It's a theorem by Bonk and Schramm. From 2000. I tell you any hyperbolic group. And in fact, their statement is much more general than this. Any Gromov hyperbolic space with locally controlled complexity can be quasi-isometrically embedded. In fact, their statement is much better than this. The multiplicative constant of the quasi-isometry is equal to 1. So you only change the distance by an additive constant. Can be quasi-isometrically embedded in HK if K is large enough. And the large enough only depend on your hyperbolic group. So what does this mean? If you want to play this proof as before, you take your hyperbolic group, you put it in HK. In HK, you play this game. Your group is not dense, it's not everywhere. Maybe there are already holes in your group. And then maybe some part of the barrier is not needed, but you don't care. You put the whole barrier like that. And the proof works. You don't need again to change anything. The barrier, in fact, it will be a set of points in the group. The barrier, it will be the set of points in the group which, yes, you can also try to formulate it in an intrinsic way using a Gromov product. It does not work perfectly, but you can formulate it in terms of Floyd distance. And with Floyd distance, you can play that directly in the group. At that time, I didn't know anything about Floyd distance. But yeah, if you want to do it in an intrinsic way, it's possible. You don't need this Bonk-Schramm theorem. But I like pictures. Okay, so you apply this Bonk-Schramm theorem, you go inside HK, and at the end of the proof, in all hyperbolic groups, and for all symmetric measures. Modulo a priori bounds. We need some information to start with. You see, this information seems rather weak, but with this trick of choosing random barriers, we could convert something which is a result on average. If you average over all the you get something. So we could convert with this trick an average result to a point-wide result, which is true for everyone. But still, to start with, we need the average result. And how will we prove the average result? I was too pessimistic, so I will have time to tell you about the a priori bound. And I will not need this picture anymore. For now, essentially, we don't have any information on the green function. We only know that it's finite, thanks to Guivarch. The only other thing we know is that we have a super multiplicativity property. That's the trivial side of the Ancona inequality. We know that for all x, y, and z, there's a green function from x to z. It's at least the green function from x to y times the green function from y to z. Because you can concatenate passes from x to y and from y to z to get something from x to z. And since that's the only information we have, we will just use this and the finiteness. Supermultiplicativity is something extremely powerful in mathematics. For instance, Jean-François mentioned Kingman's theorem that tells you if you have something just multiplicative, it's enough to get an analog of Birkhoff's theorem, which is called Kingman's theorem. It's very efficient to write down inequalities. But here, this inequality goes in the wrong direction for us, because we want an upper bound. And it tells you that when you multiply, it becomes larger. If it would become smaller, we would be very happy, because we will say, okay, you take a bound on the sphere of radius 1, and then on the sphere of radius 2, you get a bound from above from what you see on the sphere of radius 1, and so on. But here, it goes in the wrong direction. So it's not clear how it could help us. Okay, 5 minutes. It's not clear how it could help us, but you will see. I'm not claiming something deep. Here, it's just a trick. Just remember that supermultiplicativity is useful, and then you can forget about the rest of the proof. Well, for the first part of the proof, I think it's a good insight to have to try to build things at random if you don't know what to do. So let me define a function like that. For r at most the spectral radius, I define a function fr of n. It's a sum for all points in the sphere of, well, gr of ex, gr of xe. The stuff we want to control. What we want to do is to control this for small r equal to big R, and to show that for all n, I have a bound. And what I will do is I will get a bound for r strictly smaller than big R, but my bound will have to depend on nothing. And if my bound does not depend on small r or n, then I will be able to pass to the limit. So if you start from this and try to apply super multiplicativity, what you get is that fr of n times fr of m, it's bounded. Okay, there is a problem that fr of n times fr of m, you take a point on the sphere of radius n, and then you take a point on the sphere of radius m. And then you would like to look at the product xy, and to say that essentially it's on the sphere of radius n plus m. And if this were true, and you would use a super multiplicativity of the Green function, and so you would say that this quantity for x times this quantity for y is bounded by the quantity for xy. So you would get something like that. Fr of k, except, so you would get just k on the sphere of radius n plus m, except that that's not what we will get. We will get something just slightly weaker. And the reason is that if xy is on the sphere of radius n plus m, then you're happy. We'll give you some part of it. But sometimes xy is not in the sphere of radius n plus m. For instance, if x is like that, and then maybe y is, maybe n is equal to m, and y is the inverse of x. And then xy is, you're coming back to the identity, you're definitely not on the sphere of radius n plus m. In this case, what you can do is you just put them in general position by adding an intermediate point. You put some a here, and then if you do this, and you're in a free group, you see that essentially xay will be at distance of the origin, which is the length of x plus the length of a plus the length of y. And you can choose a with a uniform bound to have this kind of behavior. And this uniform bound I call big A. And with this picture, for each x and y, you put them in a general position by adding an intermediate point A, you get this. And that's not only true for big R, it's true for all small r. And maybe here you have some constant, but that does not depend on anything. And once you're here, you remember that I told you this is nice because it's a part of the derivative of the Green function. You know that if r is strictly smaller than r, the sum over all n of fr of n is the derivative of the Green function at the identity. And since you're strictly below the spectral radius, finite. And if you have a series which is finite, it has to tend to 0 at some point. It has to reach its maximum. And let m of r be the maximum of fr of n. And it's reached because this sequence tends to 0, say at some n. And then you take this inequality and you apply it precisely at this index n. And you will get, for n equal to m, you will get that this maximum squared is bounded by a constant times your sum from to n plus a of something that you will just bound from above by this same m of r. And this is c times a plus 1 times m of r. And now you're already happy because on the left you have a square, on the right you just have 1. So you get that the maximum is bounded by c times a plus 1. And now it's a miracle because it does not depend on r anymore. So for R strictly smaller than R, the sum of the spheres are uniformly bounded, independently of n and small r. And then you let R tend to big R, and you get that at the spectral radius, you get the same bound. And at the end of the proof. Just in time. Thank you. That's what you expect. That's what you are proving, in fact, because in the end, Ancona inequality tells you that. But you don't have this information yet. That's the problem. If you already knew that Ancona inequality were true, then you would be able to prove Ancona inequality without the symmetry assumption. But that's the kind of bootstrapping problem. Yes. Well, it works if the support, if the tail are super exponential. It's more complicated because you could jump over barriers, and so you have to separate different cases, but it still works. No. Let me give you a stupid example on the free group. So you have A, B, A minus 1, B minus 1, and take the probability of A to be equal to 1 minus 3 epsilon, and the probability of B, B minus 1, and A minus 1 to be epsilon. So you're really going more in the A direction. And then when you look at the green function for the random walk, it tends to 0 at infinity in all directions. But if you look at the green function at the spectral radius, if epsilon is small enough, it blows up exponentially to infinity in the A direction. So if you wanted to play this game, you would need to construct barriers that really avoid all the rates of A, but you don't have usable a priori estimates in this case. Don't know what to do.